Well, when you arrive in Harlem in 1935, as Kwame Nkrumah did, and blackness comes in every possible hue you can imagine, and there are people speaking and politicking around the idea of blackness, not just politics, but the politics of blackness, then you come to understand, as Kwame Nkrumah came to understand, that there's this, that blackness is in fact a global thing, that blackness is not just an African norm, a sort of unremarkable standard, that it has currents.
It's a real privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, Howard French, and the subject of his talk. Many events over the last few years, might even say the last few months, have focused our minds on the origins of the post-war international order. Certain founding moments tend to dominate our understanding of this era, particularly in Canada, I find. The creation of the United Nations in San Francisco, and of the World Bank and the IMF in Bretton Woods, the ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Conventions, the formation of NATO, and shortly thereafter of the Warsaw Pact, as the Cold War intensified between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet what radicalized the meaning of freedom, equality, and sovereignty during these years was the rise of anti-colonial nationalism, igniting the establishment of new states in Asia and Africa out of the ashes of European colonial empires. These movements simultaneously inspired the attempt to forge the non-aligned movement and the Third World Project, most famously at the Bandung Conference in 1955. Equally important, but less well known today, were ideas of Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism. The international order, according to its proponents, rested on an implicit hierarchy, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the global color line. But this line structured racial inequalities within established democracies too. Indeed, the immediate post-war decades were an era of extraordinary possibility, a time when Pan-Africanism and anti-colonial movements across the global South forged powerful alliances with Black Americans fighting for civil rights. Yet the struggle to imagine a world freed from racial hierarchy and imperial domination promised to reshape international politics, and yet this high tide failed to realize its promise at the time. As we witness renewed interventions in African politics, the resurgence of great power competition, ongoing struggles for racial justice worldwide, many perceive continuities between the past and the present. How do unfinished projects of political decolonization and civil rights shape contemporary movements for democracy, equality, and sovereignty? What can we learn from this pivotal early period? And how might we reclaim the radical vision of solidarity that once connected liberation struggles across continents? Our guest this evening has powerfully chronicled the central role played by Africa in the modern world. Howard French is a professor of journalism at Columbia University. He began his career as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post in West Africa before joining the New York Times in 1986. Over the next 2 decades, Professor French served as its bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan and the Koreas, and in China. He has also written a series of highly acclaimed books, from A Continent for the Taking, The Tragedy and Hope of Africa, and China's Second Continent, How 1 Million Migrants Are Building a New Empire, to Everything Under the Heavens, How the Past Helped Shape China's Push for Global Power, and more recently, Born into Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. His writing has been recognized by many honors, including the Overseas Press Club Award, a fellowship from the Open Society Foundation, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Maryland. And he remains a frequent contributor to many leading periodicals, from the New York Review of Books and the Atlantic Magazine to the Times Literary Supplement, to mention just a few. In 2025, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. His newest book, which is the subject of his talk this evening, is titled The Second Emancipation, The Unfinished Project of Liberation and the Modern Black Freedom Struggle. Howard will speak for about half an hour. I'll then start a conversation with him to explore some of the issues raised by his talk in the book before we open it up to your questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Howard French.
It's wonderful to be in Canada. I say that as a friendly American. I don't want to presume to know how anyone in the audience feels about this, but I rejoice every time I hear Canadians make a land acknowledgement. And I say that as somebody whose government has recently actively worked to erase acknowledgements of the past. And I can only hope that Canadians can redouble this sort of recognition and lend inspiration to peoples from neighboring countries such as mine. Sanjay and I had a conversation earlier this afternoon, and I'm not going to try to recite it now, but one of its elements was where did the idea from this book, for this most recent book, come from? And I gave him an honest account, but I left something out, which I'm going to start with tonight. And that is, well, the part of the original answer was that this book picks up where my last book, Born in Blackness, left off, which is at the end of the Second World War. But the piece that I left out of my answer to Sanjay was a conversation that I had with my editor, an editor whose partnership I've cherished and who I've benefited from quite a bit. And for some reason, this editor had a bug in him, and I still don't know why, about Kwame Nkrumah. He said, I've been wanting to have a book about Kwame Nkrumah for the longest time. This is a veteran editor. He's been in the business for a very long time. I've never had anybody speak to me this way before. And I thought to myself, do I really want to write a book about Kwame Nkrumah? I have been associated with, meaning I have been traveling in West Africa since 1975 and visiting Ghana since 1975, eventually married a woman from Ghana. I speak a little bit of languages from Ghana. I thought I knew the story of Kwame Nkrumah already. In fact, I thought most of what one needs to know about Kwame Nkrumah is readily available in the public record, and anybody who wishes to know about Kwame Nkrumah can easily discover what they need to find out about Kwame Nkrumah. But Bob, my editor, was persistent and kept nudging me, Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah. And so out of respect for Bob, I knew that I wanted to do a book picking up in 1945, and to a certain extent, Ghana was a logical place to begin because Ghana launches the independence revolution in sub-Saharan Africa a decade or so hence, right, from the end of the Second World War. So Ghana was an obvious place to look for a beginning of the story, but I wasn't so bracketed on Kwame Nkrumah. And then I began to, as I said, out of respect for my editor, to sort of poke around. And it's what I am going to speak to in my introductory remarks that I discovered. I've organized this book really as a kind of, it's actually 3 books that I've tried to wrestle into one. And I'm going to try to make sense of that to you, even though few of you will have read the book. First of all, this is a global history of Pan-Africanism. This book's 3 global histories, if I can cheat on myself and tell you the takeaway in advance. It's first a global history of Pan-Africanism, and this was an area of great discovery for me. I knew, as many of you will know, that there was a big blossoming of Pan-Africanist thought in the earliest 20th century, and that some very well-known people are associated with this, probably most prominently Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican who moves to London and then to New York and builds actually quite a remarkable movement around the idea of uniting Africa and people of African descent and forging, hopefully, this was his goal, a continental movement, or even a continental government. So a lot of people think that was Nkrumah's thing, but Garvey was there more than half a century before Nkrumah rose to any great station in life. The discovery part of this for me was that Pan-Africanism is a much older idea. In fact, it's an idea that arises even before the American Civil War. So in the research of this book, I read into the lives of some of the principal figures of this kind of deeper Pan-Africanism, deeper in terms of time. And I mentioned some of the names to Sanjay there in the book. One of them, just to give you a sense of how deep the history of the idea of Pan-Africanism is, was a man named David Walker, born in Boston somewhere in the 1780s, who in the early 19th century, somewhere, I'm not citing exact dates here, these are in the book, I think around 1825, articulates a formula for the idea of Pan-Africanism that almost rhymes to the word with what Kwame Nkrumah would be saying in the 1950s. And that is that until all of Africa is free, not only will no African be free, but no person of African descent will be free. This is the essence of the Pan-African ideal, right? And so if you're not African and you're not of African descent, you may wonder why would somebody presuppose that the unity of Africans or of Africa and a greater unity of Africa with its diaspora is essential to the freedom and security of not just Africans, but people of African descent. And I think to plumb that answer, to begin to wrestle with that answer, one must consider the degree of desecration suffered by the African continent in the imperial age. In fact, even before the imperial age, when for centuries, beginning in the 1500s, on average, until the end of the transatlantic slave trade, 100,000 people per year, every year, throughout all of those years, were taken away from the continent for the purposes of building wealth for other people in the Western Hemisphere, overwhelmingly in the pursuit of commodity crop production through chattel slavery. Africa was not just the scene of the trafficking of these people across the Atlantic, but it was subsequently the scene of colonial domination and of subdivision. And so this notion that Africa and Africans and extra Africans, Africans from outside of the continent, have a project of repair and restitution and unity that they must turn to if they are going to find their place in the world, I think flows from this desecration, this very prolonged desecration. So this book is in the first instance, a tracing of the history of this idea and an examination of its movement across time and geographies, and it's really astounding. David Walker announces this notion of the necessity of black people everywhere to conjoin in the pursuit of freedom. And then subsequently, David Walker is an American, and subsequently, but not too much later, in the mid to late 1800s, you have thinkers like a Sierra Leonean named Africanus Horton, or Edward Blyden, who in West Africa are propounding much the same thing, saying that this scheme that the Europeans have set up for us of balkanized, cookie-cutter-shaped colonies where all of the wealth is being drained away and the administrative power is given over to foreigners, to Europeans, to dominate and to regulate our lives is obviously not to our benefit and is in fact the principal obstacle to our advancement, right? And that the solution therefore is to overcome this condition is that we must surmount the divisions that have been imposed upon us and try to achieve some kind of greater unity, some new dispensation for ourselves that will allow us to bulk up and to achieve economies of scale and political movements of scale that will force the world to recognize us as people to reckon with. Okay, so that's the first book, the first of the three books that are hopefully not too awkwardly wrestled into one tome. The second book is A Global History of Africa. What do I mean, a global history of Africa? So if my previous book, Born in Blackness, was a history of how I argue, Africa and the labor extracted from Africa were the key motivations, they were the key drivers of the accumulation of wealth that allowed the West to become the predominant force in the world, beginning somewhere in the 19th century. Some people date it a little bit earlier. That this is the result of the centuries of extraction of labor, which I've already spoken to, and of the accumulation of wealth out of plantation agriculture, not only which allowed the West to rise above other parts of the world and to dominate them, other parts of the world like China and India, for example, which had each been more advanced in terms of wealth and science and learning and philosophy and many other things in previous eras. Africa in the modern era was also an important driver of events in the world. And so this global history of Africa is an attempt to pick up that story, going beyond the chattel slavery story, going beyond the plantation agriculture story, going beyond the creation of the West. I argue in Born in Blackness that Africa and Africans are the glue that made the West, that the United States and the Caribbean would never have been settled on the timeline and with the intensity that they were settled had there not been African labor placed by force at the disposition of the colonizers. It would not have been, I can say this in Canada, I don't know a better word than the French word for this. The colonies would not have been rentable without the productive labor of people brought in chains from Africa. Okay, so what is the global history of Africa after that? So in what we find in the 20th century, and the story that I trace in my book in the 20th century, is that Africans are surprisingly deeply involved in the struggles of Europeans and in the conflicts of Europeans throughout the 20th century. They're fighting in large numbers and working in other roles in large numbers, often conscripted, often as, in effect, indentured laborers in the First World War and in the Second World War. The Europeans were not, who have in many ways been tremendous, formidable record keepers, actually were not great preservers of the record of this. And so figuring out the demographics of African participation in the world wars is an ongoing task. There are scholars who are still struggling to come to terms with this in terms of exact numbers. But we can say grosso modo that 1 million Africans participated in each of those conflicts. And yet, these remain practically unknown stories in the West. I often refer to the products of Hollywood to make you understand the degree of erasure. How many of you have ever seen a World War movie that had Africans in it? I'm going to guess none of you, right? The global history of Africa is not just a history of war, but it's also a history of capital accumulation. It's also a history of commerce, of Africa, the use of Africa as markets, which W.E.B. Du Bois focused on in many of his writings. That, in fact, to believe Du Bois's arguments, the world wars actually grew out of a struggle for domination of colonial markets among European powers. And that should, if that's true, and I believe he has a very coherent argument, that tells you the value of the commerce for the Europeans of these, and this is not just an African story, but of these colonial domains, right? So the global history of Africa encompasses not just war, but this commerce, and brings us to Ghana, which is the sort of centerpiece of my story, where early in the 20th century, cocoa production is introduced. Ghana had been a site of gold extraction for a very long time, going back to the pre-modern era. But in the early 20th century, Ghana becomes a site of cocoa planting. And actually, well, I won't get into the details because I don't want to speak too long here. But by the Second World War, Ghana is a source of great wealth for Britain. By the end of the Second World War, Ghana is, after Malaysia, the second leading source of foreign exchange for Britain. Britain is on its back economically after the devastation of the war, and Malaysia with tin and Ghana with gold, but especially with cocoa, are the two leading sources of foreign exchange for the British Exchequer. So this book develops a notion of this global history of the 20th century of Africa, these in ways that have been rendered invisible, where Africa is actually indispensable to the workings of the West through its various processes of both wealth accumulation and conflict. The third global history is the global history of Kwame Nkrumah, and that's probably the story that most people will come to the book expecting to read about, and it is indeed a thick thread of the narrative of the book. It's the story of a child who was born in the extreme southwest of the Gold Coast, as Ghana was called then as a British colony, right practically on the border with Ivory Coast, which was a French colony. Born into a very modest family, this child, the only child of a junior wife, meaning a mother whose husband had several wives in the same compound. And it's the story of how his mother somehow convinced his father, who had numerous other children, to devote whatever marginal income he could afford to set aside for the person who would become known as Kwame Nkrumah's education. He was not born as Kwame Nkrumah. He was born as Francis Nuia. This is a story of extraordinary encounters and coincidences, and we'll get into a few of them, but it's unusually rich in this sort of thing. Kwame Nkrumah's mother somehow is determined to have her son among this brood of children be the one who gets an education. She gets him into a one-room schoolhouse run by a Catholic priest in the region. The British, who are extracting lots of money from the Gold Coast, as I've told you, have put no money into education in the Gold Coast. I want to repeat that for emphasis. No money into education in the Gold Coast. So it's only by virtue of religious missionary schools that he was able to get a start in his education. The first coincidence that occurs is Kwame Nkrumah's childhood takes place it coincides with the first relatively progressive governor in the Gold Coast. For some reason, governors I don't know what it would have been like in, say, India or in other parts of the British Empire, but governors had tremendous sway in the Gold Coast, right? And so the personality and the ideology and character and approach of the governor made a huge difference in the way the place was governed. In Gold Coast, in West Africa, the colonial office was not heavy-handed. Right? So Nkrumah grows up, his childhood is at a time when, for the first time, there's a progressive governor in the Gold Coast. Progressive meaning beginning to think, hey, maybe we should actually do something about education here. Okay, I'll tell you how this ends up in a moment. But before I do so, the deputy of this governor takes a tour of the colony, and he goes to the west of of Ghana, and he enters into this one-room schoolhouse, and the Catholic priest pulls him aside, and he says, "There's this incredible kid here. We need to do something about him. This is not a normal child. He's really endowed and eager to learn, and has tremendous drive." There's some funny pieces to this, because Nkrumah initially did not want to go to school. His mother had to sit outside of the school to make sure he didn't run away every day. Anyway, what this leads to is Kwame Nkrumah is taken to the event after a while. He's taken to the capital, where by dint of the first big coincidence, an academy is being opened for the very first time in the colony. So this place of huge extraction, under a progressive governor, for the first time, an academy, meaning a fancy boarding high school. There's no university. A boarding high school is created under colonial authority for the first time. Kwame Nkrumah enters the very first class of this academy. It's just an extraordinary biographical coincidence, right? While he's in Accra, the capital of the Gold Coast, there's unusual things taking place. There's a locally owned, meaning by an African newspaper that has hired an editor from Nigeria who begins to rail against colonial rule in a very articulate way, right? And Kwame Nkrumah begins to read the editorials of this newspaper. Well, the editor of that newspaper, the Nigerian man who edited that newspaper, would eventually become the first president of Nigeria. Think of the coincidence, right? Nnamdi Azikiwe. At the same time, the deputy headmaster of the academy that Nkrumah went to was a graduate of Columbia University and a very learned and disciplined man. And Azikiwe, the future president of Nigeria, and Kwegir Agre, the deputy headmaster of the academy, had both come under the influence of Marcus Garvey's writings and were imbued with this belief, this kind of protean idea that Africans have to come together somehow to overcome their condition. And so this is the first stage of Kwame Nkrumah's global education, the making of a global Kwame Nkrumah. These two men, these two mentors, had each studied, not just Agre, but also Azikiwe had both studied in the United States. Agre had studied at Columbia. Azikiwe had studied at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, one of the earliest historically black colleges and universities in the United States. And each of them urged Kwame Nkrumah, who was obviously gifted and driven, not to do the normal thing for the extremely small elite of Gold Coasters who got any opportunity to go overseas and study, not to do the usual thing and go to Britain, but to go to the United States where a window on a new world would be open to them. Let me tell you what I mean by this. So Nkrumah does indeed go to the United States. Azikiwe writes a letter of introduction to him to Lincoln University. He shows up to Lincoln University without the funds to study there and persuades them to allow him to start school and to make up for the money somehow along the way. Never happened today, right? Anyway, Nkrumah arrives by ship in New York City, spends a week or 10 days or whatever it was in Harlem, sort of at the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance, and I believe, discovers for the first time, not literally, but figuratively, that he's a black man. Why would I say Kwame Nkrumah, who was obviously a black man, discovered that he was a black man in New York City? Well, if you're born in the hinterland of Gold Coast, where everybody is black, and you don't even see any white people, and you get your subsequent education in the capital of a colony like this, where almost everybody is still black, blackness is not a feature, it's not a remarkable feature of life. You don't walk around every day pondering your condition as a black man or trying to understand the implications of blackness. Well, when you arrive in Harlem, in 1935, as Kwame Nkrumah did, and blackness comes in every possible hue you can imagine, and there are people speaking and politicking around the idea of blackness, not just politics, but the politics of blackness, then you come to understand, as Kwame Nkrumah came to understand, that that blackness is in fact a global thing, that blackness is not just an African norm, a sort of unremarkable standard, that it has currents and traditions and depth and texture and tensions within it, right? He spends a week or 10 days in Harlem and he's listening to people on their soapbox giving speeches and sermons. He goes to Black Baptist churches, actually, which kind of shocks him because Kwame Nkrumah had received a Jesuit training education, religiously speaking, in the Gold Coast. And Jesuits and Black Baptists, let me tell you, they're not quite the same, right? So he goes to the Abyssinian Baptist Church and he sees African Americans engaging in their Sunday devotions with a whole lot of animation and all of that. He goes off to Lincoln University eventually and to pay his fees, and I'm going to try to wrap this up because I know Sanjay's got a lot of questions, as you will. And he begins preaching in the Mid-Atlantic in Baptist and Methodist churches to be able to honor his school fees. And he begins to deepen his understanding of this broader blackness, that had never occurred to him as a youngster in Ghana. He goes further onward to Howard University. Kwame Nkrumah accumulates 4 degrees in short order at Lincoln University and at Penn University of Pennsylvania. But he's visiting Washington, D.C. frequently in the 1930s at a time when Howard University is really a citadel of global African American and African thought, where Howard University had a killer's row roster of intellectual talent at the time. And he begins to rub shoulders with these people, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, Ralph Bunche, on and on and on and on. And so this is the sort of second phase of the global Kwame Nkrumah, who understands not just that blackness is a big, sort of almost uncontainable thing, but that black people are plugged into the currents of world thought, and that black people have intellectual traditions, and that black people have contentious arguments among themselves. He falls under the mentorship of some of these people, most notably C.L.R. James. And that's a good way for me to reach the last phase of this global Kwame Nkrumah story. After a decade in the United States, Nkrumah thinks he wants to get a law degree in Britain, and he applies to LSE and to a couple of other places. And James, C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian intellectual who is on the faculty of Howard, writes him a letter of introduction to a man in London named George Padmore, who is a truly remarkable figure, who is probably one of the most impressive activists whose story I've ever encountered in my life. Padmore, in an era before cell phones and the internet, obviously, is maintaining networks of communication and journalism with people all over the African continent and throughout the Caribbean, trying to help foster the idea of pushing for independence as the Second World War is ending. Nkrumah arrives in London in 1945 at the very end of the war, and Padmore takes him under his wing, and Nkrumah demonstrates his energy and fervor very quickly, and Padmore, another great coincidence, 1945 happens to be the year of the latest and most important of a series of Pan-African congresses. And this one is held in Manchester, and as a sign of confidence in Nkrumah, Padmore makes Nkrumah the Secretary General of this conference. He goes to the conference, he meets W.E.B. Du Bois, and another extraordinary moment in the making of the global Kwame Nkrumah, and to compress this tremendously, over the 2 years he spent in Britain, during that time, there's a group of elite lawyers, Gold Coast lawyers. The Gold Coast elite, in terms of the educated elite, is still extraordinarily small, but there is a group of people who have done well in law, who went to Britain to study and have done well in law, and they're beginning to think about whether or how to form a political party to eventually push for independence. And they're aware of how unable they are to speak in the language of the common people of the Gold Coast. They've been trained at the bar in London, and they've lost all ability to all common touch. And so they write to the student movement, African student movement in Britain, and ask them to recommend someone, and they recommended Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame Nkrumah, to make a very long story short, takes a ship back to the Gold Coast to be the Secretary General of this proto-party, very quickly falls out with these people because they are so prosaic in their approach to pushing for independence, and from jail, eventually, but in actually fairly short order, organizes a political party, begins to wins an election, which is the first in a series of elections that eventually forced the British hand in granting independence to Ghana in 1957, and the rest, as they say, is history. The details are important, but I'm going to stop and allow my interlocutor to ask a few questions.
Okay. So I'd start by saying two immediate things, I suppose three. One was the book is written as eloquently as Howard speaks, and he just started to touch on a lot of the stories that are in this book. It's an astonishing book. I read a lot of books, like many of you do here, and I have to say, every once in a while, you come across a book where every 2 or 3 pages, you're like, I didn't know that. I didn't know, and like astonishing things, astonishing people, a lot of the figures that he mentions, some of them be familiar to people like C.L.R. James and W.B. Du Bois, these are legendary, towering figures of the 20th century. But the book is peopled with so many individuals who are so remarkable that I'd never heard of. And that is one of the most uplifting aspects of the book. It's just really fascinating to see people who've done extraordinary things. I mean, you mentioned Padmore, and he's a better known, more well understood figure than many others. But there's so many figures in this book that in itself is just truly enlightening. It really comes alive. And as Howard says, there are multiple stories here, multiple layers. Through the story of Nkrumah, that a lot of these other stories get stitched together. Questions. So I guess the first one to start with is, as you say, I mean, fortune is very kind to Nkrumah, but he's also an extraordinary figure, like a lot of these stories, where he seizes every chance. I mean, he makes the most of every opportunity he has. And one thing that's striking about the book, it's just how many remarkable people kind of end up in the same place. Like Lincoln University, my own ignorance, I'd scarcely heard of it. In the past, I had a vague sense of it. But this is a university which you describe, or some people describe at that time, like the Black Princeton. And of course, Nkrumah goes there. Langston Hughes was a student there. Thurgood Marshall was a student there, right? So
first black Supreme Court justice in the United States.
Right. So, they're there. And then you talk about Howard University. And Howard University, which I visited and I had friends who've attended, as you say, killer's row of these phenomenal intellectuals. But not just intellectuals, because they're political activists, they're organizers, they're social critics. So one thing that's really striking, if you tell us a little bit, is how did it come to be that all these remarkable people kind of gravitate, it's like a center of gravity, that they get pulled into these places at around the same time. I mean, there's a lot of ferment in the interwar period, as we know. And we could tell this story from a Chinese angle or an Indian story, a Brazilian. A lot of the leading figures of these anti-colonial movements come to the United States, or they come to, as you say, mostly in Europe, in Britain or France, wherever it might be, and they rub shoulders with each other, and a lot of ideas are circulating. Right. But what is it about this particular story? You say Pan-Africanism has an old history, but this is a moment of great, great ferment. So why is it that at this period, this is what's happening?
So you've asked two interesting questions in one. One of them seemed to be, why did such extraordinary numbers of extraordinary people become concentrated in a place like Howard University? And I want to answer that. And the other one is, why was there such ferment in a moment like this? And these are two separate problems, and each deserves to be treated. I've just finished another book, which is unrelated to this one, which is about music in the 20th century, jazz in the 20th century. And late in the book, I get into Harlem, where in the space of 3 or 4 blocks, square blocks, you have the most extraordinary roster of jazz talent, but not just jazz talent, intellectual talent, civic leadership, and other sorts of talents concentrated. And this forced me to wrestle with the question, there's a romantic idea of the old Harlem and Harlem Renaissance and all of this, and it's easy to lose sight of why the concentration why there was such a rich concentration of people like this in such a small place at one time, the answer is that the rest of the country was not open to these people.
They have nowhere else to go.
They had nowhere else to go. This was the result of active forces in the United States, in the society, and with the Nkrumah story, one could actually say, in the world, which made almost everywhere else, other than where they wound up, unwelcoming to them.
Right.
Right? And so that's what made a Lincoln University special, and then to an even greater extent made a Howard University so special in that moment. Right? It wasn't magic. It was a product of active ugliness in terms of the social and racial life of the country, right? Why so much ferment in these years, though? This could be a very long answer. I'm going to focus on the 1940s because this is the way to answer this most concisely. But the 1930s are a time of extraordinary ferment as well, where capitalism is in crisis.
Because of the Depression.
Because of the Depression, and lots of really, really big questions are kind of in the air that people had not been asking previously, and in fact haven't so much asked of themselves since then, right? Can capitalism and democracy go together? Can capitalism or democracy survive? Is socialism the way? Et cetera, right? These are sort of the driving sources of animation in the 1930s. But let's come to the 1940s. So specifically the end of the Second World War. I referred in my Global History of Africa spiel, I said that Africans had participated in the Second World War in large numbers and had been rendered invisible. Most of you never heard this. I don't even want people to trust me. Go Google it, go to we're in a library it, I don't want to promote AI, but do what you need to do and try to find out, right?
Yeah.
Africans were deeply involved in the Second World War, and they went off, usually not voluntarily, but nonetheless went off into combat or into supply or support roles in the Second World War with a kind of implicit understanding that the Europeans, when they proved their worth to the Europeans, whether it was through the valor of the battlefield or in other roles, the Europeans would just do the decent human thing, that it's just normal. We have signed up for your agenda somehow. When we come back, you're going to make us whole. I don't mean whole monetarily. I mean whole in human terms. You're going to honor us as human beings. You're going to help restore our dignity. You're going to help free us. You're going to stop trying to dominate us. Okay. So the same thing was happening in African American society. Africans were conscripted into the war. African Americans had to demand to be able to fight in World War II. The U.S. Army was segregated formally and severely, right? And African Americans were deliberately kept in small numbers through most of the war and kept away from combat in most of the war, right? African Americans said, we will not accept that. We demand to participate in this struggle, right? And they did so expecting that when they came back from this sacrifice and this effort, that they will have proven, they didn't think they needed to prove this to themselves. They thought they would prove to any decent human being their worth and their merit, that they deserved to be treated as equals, that they deserved, in fact, to be treated for the first time as citizens, as true citizens in the whole and full sense of the word.
Right.
And when they returned from World War II, that was not the case.
Yeah.
When the Africans returned from World War II, that was not the case. Kwame Nkrumah gets his start having just been recruited by these lawyers that I spoke to, because there's a riot in Accra of ex-Gold Coast servicemen who had fought in Burma on behalf of the British and had actually been responsible for a rare British land victory during the war over the Japanese in Burma, in the jungles of Burma. the Ghanaian troops had played a decisive role in this. They came back to Ghana not just proud that they had proven we did better than the white troops, expecting that they were going to be remunerated, given pensions, given housing, et cetera, and they were cheated of that. And when they were cheated, they tried to march on the colonial governor's offices, and the governor's troops opened fire on them, and a riot ensued. Kwame Nkrumah gets his start in politics because of this violation. He had nothing to do with the riot. The British rounded anybody up who had talked about independence, so they rounded up Kwame Nkrumah, but he was out of town and had no role in this. Right. And so why I'm telling you this little Nkrumah story is that the U.S. civil rights movement and the African independence movement both get their spur from the fact that this notion of being made whole, of being paid, of being respected, of being granted citizenship was not fulfilled in the wake of the war, in the wake of the sacrifices that black people on both sides of the Atlantic had made. And this becomes a driving force in both of these movements, which, as you know, in the book, eventually become deeply conjoined, intertwined. In the 1950s, so a decade hence, the American Civil Rights Movement, which many of you have heard a tremendous amount about, actually draws inspiration from the African independence movement, from the example of Kwame Nkrumah. Most people have no, I'm sorry, I don't mean to insult anybody, but the baseline idea in the West about Africa is there's nothing to be learned from Africa, that nothing starts in Africa, that Africa is not a place where important things happen. Like if it's in the news, it's the last thing in the news, right? The American Civil Rights Movement gained much of its impetus from the example of the African independence movement. Yes.
Yeah, so there's so many things to get to in the book. So I wanted to ask, so one thing just to stitch that last point together is, in the book, Howard talks about the sign of the double V victory that the soldiers were using, because that's what they began to realize, that we want to have victory in the war abroad vis-a-vis tyranny and fascism, but we want to be emancipated at home too, right? So it's a double movement. Where do we move to next? And we want to get to Ghana, but also the American Civil Rights Movement.
You mentioned Langston Hughes, who had been at Lincoln University, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Langston Hughes, very famous African-American poet who got his start in the Harlem Renaissance, wrote poems about this. About them asking us to go kick Hitler's ass, but we got fascism right here at home. In fact, Hitler's learning from us, right?
There's an anecdote in the story. I'm going to jump ahead just because we have to get back to God, but it's connecting to this. So Nkrumah goes back to the Gold Coast. He has lots of famous slogans. One is self-government now, like a lot of anti-colonial leaders. That's his. Another one is seek ye first the political kingdom and all will be added to it. And he wins these elections, as Howard was saying, the first one from jail, and then two more. And then the governor at the time, Arden Clark, realizes the writing's on the wall. Britain's been devastated by the war. It's bankrupt. Very difficult times in England in the 1950s. And so they quit. They'd already quit India, literally quit India, and the partition happened, as we know, 1947. So this is a decade later. And what's really striking in the book, and it's extraordinary, Nkrumah so he becomes the first prime minister. It's a global media event. Dignitaries from around the world come. Louis Armstrong can't come, but his wife comes, Lucille. And all these people showing up, and as Howard was saying, really important black media like Jet Magazine, Ebony, who've been writing about Nkrumah the whole time. And that's one of the things you talk about, is saying, we're having this struggle for civil rights in the United States. And one of the most important people who come, straight off the Montgomery bus boycott, is Martin Luther King Jr. And King and Nkrumah meet. So can you tell us a little bit, brief? I know that's an interesting story. They have a lot in common, and they really they're drawn to each other. What does King learn from, because we know the story about King and Gandhi, right? And Nkrumah, in this period, the New York Times, your old employer, says that Nkrumah is as important or as famous as Gandhi, which today, when you hear about it, many more people know about Mahatma Gandhi than Kwame Nkrumah. So that tells you about the erasure of that history. What does King learn from Nkrumah, or what is it that inspires him?
So King, at this moment, King is such a remarkable figure. I don't want to cite his age, but I want to say he was like 30 years old or something. A very, very young man. He arrives in Ghana for the independence ceremony. He, like all of the rest of the civil rights movement, all of the who's who of American civil rights arrives in Ghana for the independence ceremonies. And Nkrumah invites Martin Luther King and his wife Coretta as his personal guests and spends time with them. And King wants to learn. It's not just Jet and Ebony. The black press back then was well funded and had huge audiences. Every city had a black newspaper or two, and they covered events in Ghana with extraordinary interest at the time. And so King is deeply aware of events. He didn't just come from the ceremony. People had been watching this, these repeated winning of elections, his winning of an election from jail. King knew all of that stuff. And so what does King want to learn from Nkrumah? King is really just beginning to flirt with and to articulate a kind of proto-Gandhiism. And what King finds in Nkrumah is a living example of Gandhian ideas.
What Nkrumah calls positive action.
Positive action, right. And Nkrumah walks King through his philosophy of positive action, which is derived from Gandhiism. And Nkrumah is doing so not just as a theorist, not just as somebody who can give eloquent speeches, but somebody who has just spent the better part of a decade winning power through positive action, through a Gandhian approach to basically encouraging the population, forcing the hand of the colonists by, it's like the strikes in India that stop the consumption of basic goods, right? Yeah. Forcing the hand of the colonists by telling the population, don't buy anything, don't work, don't participate if they don't grant us what we're demanding, right? And Nkrumah won that way. And so King goes away from this visit to Ghana, and he spends the next few weeks lecturing, and I quote some of the sermons, lecturing his church on Dexter Avenue each Sunday for a lengthy period about the lessons he had learned in Ghana, and saying, in effect, I've seen the solution now. I know that this can work. This is not just a theory. This isn't, the concept has been demonstrated.
Right. So that's what's really remarkable is the travel. I see Sergio was circulating, but I'm going to ask one.
There's one more thing I want to tag onto this. I'm sorry. I'm very long in my answers, and I've tried to cure myself, but I'm not. I'm useless. So later in the civil rights movement, I quote James Baldwin in the book on this topic. Later in the movement, so the King stuff is before the lunch counter boycotts and the freedom rides on buses to the South and all of that. This is before any of that's happened. Later, young black people, sometimes accompanied by white people, are occupying segregated luncheon counters throughout the South and saying, we're not going to get up. We're demanding to be served, and if you try to arrest us or beat us, we're not even going to resist. You can hit us over the head, you can do whatever you want, you can shoot us, potentially, if you want to. I'm telling you this because this is an articulation of the fulfillment of the how far it went of the Gandhian ideal, which King first saw in action in Ghana. And the Baldwin quote in the book is that young black people in the South during this moment in the movement had received their inspiration precisely from the example of Ghana, that it was when they saw Ghana do this that they gathered their courage and said, we can do this too.
Okay. I'm looking for Sergio because he's my boss.
Right here.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have to
Well, then we're
keep
going to
Q&A rather short. Go ahead.
Well, I think I'm going to try to push with Sergio on this one today. So there's, you know what I'll do? I'll put out 2 or 3 more themes, and then you, if you're interested in them, can ask Howard, so he gets a chance to tell you about it. What are the other ones? So we've been talking about how Nkrumah becomes Nkrumah, but then we haven't talked even yet, and we're at 8, the story about his prime ministership. And in a nutshell, he becomes prime minister in 1957, does some very important things, expanding schools, healthcare, roads. But then there's a set of economic policies that trigger inflation, and there's more labor unrest. And then by the early 1960s, he's concentrating power. And in Ghana, like many other states that become free, there's a growing concentration of power, and in some cases leading to a one-party state like it did in Ghana. He outbans opposition parties after multiple attempts on his life. 1964, there's a coup when he's visiting Vietnam, I believe that's right, and then he's forced into exile, where he dies in exile in Romania from cancer in 1972. So a very sort of sad ending. We've been talking about this incredible moment, but it's kind of a tragic story. And the other one I just want to put on the table, if you want to say anything, and then we'll open it up, is the whole idea of Pan-Africanism. Nkrumah had this idea of a United States of Africa, a regional federation that would have the heft, as you say, to withstand the superpowers and former colonial powers. But not everybody, including his neighbor in Côte d'Ivoire, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, wants to be a part of this project. They want to hang on to the new nation states they have and consolidate their power. So I'm not going to ask you a question because I think then we'll run into that. But I just want to put those out there, that those are 2 really important parts of the story, that the vision of Pan-Africanism, which Nkrumah articulates, has some buyers, like Emmett Sékou Touré in Guinea, but not others. And so that's part of the clash. And the other one is the difficulty of maintaining a parliamentary form of government in Ghana itself, like in many other places. And you see a sort of rise of autocracy.